I stood in the sterile corporate office, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, clutching my security badge, while Derek Walsh smirked at me from behind his mahogany desk. The CIO's son-in-law had just announced my termination in front of 30 colleagues, his voice dripping with satisfaction as he called me dead weight that had been dragging down productivity for months. My coworkers avoided eye contact, some fidgeting with their coffee cups, others pretending to study their computer screens. The humiliation burned through my chest like acid. Derek leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, declaring I had exactly 15 minutes to clear out my belongings and disappear forever. I stepped forward, calmly placed my badge on his desk, and delivered the words that would haunt him forever. 18 months earlier, I had walked through these same glass doors with hope and determination burning in my chest. TechFlow Solutions desperately needed someone to save their crumbling IT infrastructure, and I was their answer. The previous technical team had failed spectacularly, leaving behind a maze of outdated servers, security vulnerabilities that could sink the company overnight, and network crashes that cost thousands of dollars every single day. I remember my first meeting with the executive team, sitting in that same conference room where Derek would later humiliate me. Robert Walsh, the chief information officer, had explained the situation with barely concealed desperation. Their biggest client, Meridian Financial Services, was threatening to terminate a $12 million annual contract unless the constant system failures stopped immediately. Two smaller clients had already jumped ship, taking their business to competitors who could promise basic reliability. The challenge excited me more than intimidated me. I had spent 5 years at Morrison Tech designing enterprise solutions for Fortune 500 companies, and I knew exactly what TechFlow needed. But I also knew it would require every ounce of my expertise, creativity, and dedication to pull off such a complete overhaul. Those first few weeks, I practically lived at the office. I would arrive before sunrise, armed with multiple cups of coffee and detailed architectural diagrams I had sketched at home the night before. The existing infrastructure was worse than I had imagined during the interview process. Critical databases were held together with outdated patches and prayers. The backup systems hadn't been tested in over 2 years. Security protocols belonged in a museum not protecting sensitive client information in 2023. I started from the ground up, designing a completely custom architecture that would revolutionize how TechFlow handled data processing, storage, and security. The system I envisioned would use proprietary algorithms to optimize database queries, reducing processing time by 70%, while simultaneously strengthening security through layered encryption protocols that I developed specifically for their unique needs. The work consumed me completely. 70-hour weeks became my normal routine as I coded intricate backup procedures, designed automated monitoring systems, and created sophisticated fail-safes that would prevent the catastrophic crashes that had plagued the company for years. Every component had to integrate seamlessly with every other component, creating a technological symphony that would perform flawlessly under the most demanding conditions. During those months of intense development, Derek Walsh materialized like a shadow I couldn't shake. He had been appointed IT director 3 months before my arrival, a promotion that raised eyebrows throughout the company, given his complete lack of technical background. His business administration degree from a mediocre state university hardly qualified him to oversee complex system architecture, but nepotism had opened doors that merit alone never could. Our first serious clash occurred during a department meeting in November. I was presenting the preliminary design for the new security framework when Derek interrupted me mid-sentence, demanding that I explain the technical concepts in language that everyone could understand. His tone suggested I was deliberately complicating simple ideas, when in reality, I was describing genuinely complex innovations that required precise technical vocabulary. Throughout that presentation, Derek continued his interruptions, asking basic questions that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of network architecture, while positioning himself as the reasonable manager, ensuring clarity for the team. By the end of the meeting, he had twisted the narrative to make it seem like my groundbreaking security design was his initiative, guided by his strategic vision for department modernization. This pattern repeated itself in every subsequent meeting. Derek would listen carefully as I explained technical implementations, then reframe my innovations as results of his forward-thinking leadership. He began requiring that I submit detailed written explanations of all my work, ostensibly for documentation purposes, but I noticed he was presenting modified versions of these reports to his father-in-law, consistently minimizing my individual contributions while maximizing his own managerial insights. The most frustrating aspect was watching Derek take credit for solutions to problems he didn't even understand existed. When I resolved a critical database corruption issue that had been causing random data losses for months, Derek announced to the executive team that his new quality control procedures had identified and eliminated a persistent vulnerability. When I implemented automated backup verification protocols that caught 3 separate hardware failures before they could cause catastrophic data loss, Derek presented it as evidence of his proactive risk management strategies. Despite these professional frustrations, I remained focused on the technical work because the system I was building represented the pinnacle of my career achievements. Every component was custom designed to work in perfect harmony with every other component, creating something that was far greater than the sum of its individual parts. The architecture required constant fine-tuning and maintenance procedures that I performed manually each morning, ensuring optimal performance throughout each business day. I kept telling myself that eventually the results would speak for themselves. When the new infrastructure eliminated system crashes entirely and boosted processing speeds beyond anything TechFlow had ever experienced, surely upper management would recognize my contributions regardless of Derek's political maneuvering. When client satisfaction scores improved dramatically and new business started flowing in because of our newfound reliability, the truth would become impossible to ignore. But I was naive about corporate politics, and I had no idea how far Derek was willing to go to protect his position and advance his agenda. I had become so focused on the technical perfection of my system that I failed to notice I was also becoming the only person in the entire company who truly understood how it all worked together. Without realizing it, I had made myself indispensable in ways that Derek was determined to change. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. I arrived at my usual time, 6:30 in the morning, to find Derek already at his desk, despite his typical habit of rolling in around 9 o'clock. He was hunched over his computer, frantically typing notes while playing audio recordings through his headphones. When he noticed me watching, he quickly minimized the windows and offered a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Later that morning, during our weekly team meeting, Derek presented a detailed technical proposal for upgrading our network security protocols. Every recommendation he made sounded familiar, and as he continued speaking, I realized with growing horror that he was repeating almost verbatim the explanations I had given him privately the previous week about potential vulnerabilities and improvement strategies. He had been recording our conversations. My stomach dropped as I remembered all the times Derek had asked me to walk him through various technical processes, claiming he needed to understand the details for his reports to upper management. I had been flattered by his apparent interest in learning naively, believing that better communication with my supervisor would improve our working relationship. Instead, he had been systematically documenting my expertise to present as his own insights. That evening, I stayed late to investigate further. TechFlow's shared server architecture allowed department heads to access certain employee directories, and Derek had apparently forgotten to secure his personal folders properly. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Folder after folder contained detailed recordings of our technical discussions, meticulously transcribed and reorganized into professional reports that Derek had been submitting to Robert Walsh. My innovations were repackaged as Derek's strategic recommendations. My solutions to critical problems were presented as examples of Derek's effective leadership during crisis situations. My warnings about potential security risks were transformed into evidence of Derek's proactive oversight, preventing disasters before they occurred. But the recordings were only the beginning. Buried deeper in his files, I found email exchanges with Robert Walsh discussing the long-term restructuring of the IT department. Derek was building a case for eliminating my position, entirely arguing that the system had become stable enough that a senior architect was no longer necessary. He claimed that streamlining the department by removing redundant positions would improve efficiency while reducing overhead costs. The most damaging emails revealed Derek's systematic documentation of every minor system glitch or temporary slowdown, which he described as evidence of fundamental design flaws in my architecture. He conveniently omitted any mention of the dramatic improvements in overall performance, the elimination of major crashes, or the successful implementation of advanced security features that had impressed our biggest clients. One email made my hands shake with rage. Derek had written to his father-in-law that he was developing comprehensive documentation of all system procedures, suggesting that once this knowledge transfer was complete, the company could maintain operations with lower-cost technical support staff rather than highly paid specialists. He was planning to steal my intellectual property, eliminate my position, and replace me with cheap labor who would follow his instructions without questioning his authority. 3 weeks later, Derek announced that he was bringing in a systems consultant to conduct an independent review of our current infrastructure. Jake Patterson arrived with impressive credentials on paper computer science degree from a prestigious university, certifications from major technology companies, and experience at several well-known firms. Derek introduced him as a longtime friend who was generously offering his expertise to help optimize our operations. From the moment Jake logged into our systems, I could tell he was completely out of his depth. His first recommendation was to disable several automated monitoring protocols because they were generating too many alerts, apparently not understanding that these alerts were preventing minor issues from escalating into major problems. When I tried to explain the importance of these safeguards, Jake dismissed my concerns with condescending lectures about modern best practices that clearly came from outdated textbooks rather than real-world experience. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Jake's attempted optimizations caused 3 separate service disruptions during his first week, each one requiring hours of my time to diagnose and repair the damage he had caused. When I documented these incidents and requested that his system access be limited until he better understood our custom architecture, Derek accused me of being uncooperative and resistant to necessary improvements. The breaking point came when Jake nearly triggered a catastrophic security breach by modifying authentication protocols without understanding their integration with other system components. His changes would have exposed sensitive client financial data to potential external access, a violation that could have resulted in millions of dollars in fines and the immediate termination of all our major contracts. I spent an entire weekend rebuilding the security framework that Jake had compromised, working around the clock to ensure that Monday morning operations would proceed normally without any indication that our systems had been vulnerable. When Derek arrived on Monday, I handed him a detailed report explaining exactly what had happened and how I had prevented a potential disaster. Instead of thanking me for preventing a crisis, Derek wrote me up for insubordination. He claimed that I had exceeded my authority by modifying system configurations without his explicit approval, and that my actions demonstrated a dangerous pattern of disregard for proper chain of command procedures. The formal reprimand went into my personnel file with copies sent to Human Resources and Robert Walsh. That's when I finally understood Derek's complete strategy. He wasn't just planning to steal credit for my work and eliminate my position. He was actively sabotaging my professional reputation to ensure that I couldn't effectively defend myself when the time came for him to make his final move. 2 weeks later, Derek called a department meeting to announce exciting organizational changes that would streamline operations and position the IT department for future growth. He explained that evolving technology and improved system stability had created opportunities to restructure roles and responsibilities more efficiently. Starting in 30 days, my position would be eliminated as part of a comprehensive optimization initiative designed to reduce redundancy and improve cost-effectiveness. Jake Patterson would be promoted to Senior Systems Architect, taking over responsibility for maintaining and improving the infrastructure that I had designed. Derek would assume direct oversight of all technical operations, ensuring seamless coordination between strategic planning and implementation. The company would save thousands of dollars annually while gaining more agile and responsive technical support capabilities. As Derek spoke, I watched my colleagues' faces carefully. Some looked uncomfortable, clearly recognizing the injustice of the situation, but unwilling to risk their own positions by speaking up. Others seemed relieved that they weren't being targeted for elimination, grateful that someone else was bearing the cost of Derek's restructuring ambitions. A few nodded approvingly, apparently convinced by Derek's presentation that this was indeed a logical business decision rather than a personal vendetta. I remained silent during the meeting, knowing that any protests would only provide Derek with additional ammunition for his claims about my unprofessional attitude and resistance to constructive change. But as I walked back to my desk, I began planning my response. Derek might control the official communication channels and have his father-in-law's support, but he had made one crucial mistake in his rush to eliminate me. He had never bothered to truly understand the system he was so eager to take control of. Working late had become my refuge during those final weeks at TechFlow, the empty office providing a sanctuary where I could think clearly without Derek's constant surveillance. The cleaning crew knew me by name, often pausing their work to chat about the weather or weekend plans as they emptied trash cans around my desk. I had started staying until almost midnight, ostensibly to document system procedures for the transition, but really to process the betrayal and plan my next moves. It was during one of these late-night sessions that I discovered something that made my blood run cold. I had been working on creating detailed documentation of the backup verification protocols when I noticed unusual activity in the system logs. Someone had been accessing restricted databases during off hours, making modifications that required administrative privileges. The timestamps showed the access occurred well after normal business hours, and the user credentials belonged to Derek's administrative account. Curious and increasingly suspicious, I dug deeper into the access logs. What I found was a carefully orchestrated plan that revealed the true depth of Derek's deception and malice. Derek and Jake had been implementing unauthorized code modifications that would create hidden backdoor access points throughout our security infrastructure. The changes were subtle and sophisticated, designed to appear like routine system updates, while actually creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited later. They weren't just planning to frame me for incompetence. They were setting up an elaborate scheme that would destroy my professional reputation permanently. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. During the busy quarter-end processing period when system loads were at their highest and everyone was focused on meeting deadlines, they would trigger a controlled data exposure incident. Client information from our financial services accounts would be temporarily accessible through the backdoors they had created long enough to be detected by automated monitoring systems, but brief enough to limit actual damage. Jake would then heroically discover the vulnerability, tracing it back to what he would claim were fundamental flaws in my original security architecture. He would present evidence showing that my design had dangerous weaknesses that created ongoing exposure risks, and that only his immediate intervention had prevented a massive data breach that could have destroyed the company. Derek would use this manufactured crisis to justify my immediate termination for gross negligence, positioning himself as the decisive leader who had identified a critical security risk and taken swift action to protect the company. The incident would provide perfect cover for implementing Jake's replacement security framework, which would actually just remove the evidence of their backdoor access while claiming to fix the vulnerabilities they had secretly created. The beauty of their scheme was that it would be nearly impossible to disprove after the fact. The backdoor access points would be eliminated during Jake's heroic fix, erasing the evidence of their manipulation. My documentation of the original security design would appear to support their claims about fundamental architectural flaws, since I had never had reason to document defenses against threats that didn't exist until they created them. But as I continued analyzing the unauthorized modifications, I realized they had made several critical errors that revealed the artificial nature of the vulnerabilities. The backdoors were too clean, too precisely targeted to be accidental flaws in my design. Anyone with sufficient technical expertise could recognize them as intentional modifications, not inherent weaknesses. I began documenting everything, taking screenshots of the unauthorized code, copying system logs that showed the precise timing and nature of each modification. I built a comprehensive case proving that the security vulnerabilities had been artificially created rather than organically discovered. But even as I gathered this evidence, I knew it might not be enough to save me. Derek controlled all the official communication channels within the company. He had Robert Walsh's trust and support. My accusations would sound like desperate attempts by a disgruntled employee to shift blame for her own failures. Without independent technical expertise to verify my claims, it would be my word against Derek's, and he had spent months positioning himself as the credible voice of authority while undermining my reputation. The situation became even more desperate when Derek started questioning my late-night presence in the office. He began making comments about unauthorized access to restricted systems, suggesting that I was behaving suspiciously and potentially violating company security policies. I realized he had noticed my investigation and was preparing to use it against me. During our final department meeting, Derek announced that he was accelerating the timeline for my departure due to what he diplomatically described as security concerns. He explained that recent monitoring had detected unusual system access patterns that raised questions about proper authorization and oversight. While he was careful not to make direct accusations, his implications were clear enough that everyone understood I was being suspected of improper conduct. My last day would be moved up to the following Friday, giving me only 3 more days to complete the knowledge transfer and documentation that Derek claimed was essential for maintaining operational continuity. Jake would assume full responsibility for my duties, immediately ensuring seamless transition without disruption to critical business processes. As Derek spoke, I felt the walls closing in around me. His trap was perfect in every detail, timed precisely to coincide with quarter-end chaos, when everyone would be too busy and stressed to question the official narrative. He would eliminate me before I could expose his scheme, discredit any evidence I might present as the desperate lies of a terminated employee, and emerge as the hero who had saved the company from a dangerous security threat. But sitting in that meeting, watching Derek's confident smile as he described my imminent departure, I realized that he had overlooked one crucial detail in his rush to destroy me. He still had no idea how my system actually worked. For all his recordings and documentation, for all of Jake's impressive credentials and confident presentations, neither of them truly understood the intricate dependencies and custom protocols that held our infrastructure together. They had focused so intently on stealing credit and planning my downfall that they had never bothered to learn the technical details that would become critical once I was gone. And buried deep within the architecture I had created, invisible to anyone who hadn't designed it from the ground up, was a fail-safe system that Derek was about to trigger through his own arrogance and ignorance. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that normally would have energized me for the challenges ahead. Instead, I walked through TechFlow's glass doors for what I knew would be the final time as an employee, carrying a small cardboard box for my personal belongings and a resignation letter that I had spent hours crafting the night before. But Derek had planned a different kind of departure for me. I discovered that my access codes had been changed when I tried to log into my workstation at 7 o'clock. The computer screen displayed an authorization error message that I had never seen before, informing me that my credentials had been suspended, pending administrative review. When I called the IT help desk, the technician apologetically explained that Derek had ordered all my system privileges revoked effective immediately. The humiliation was calculated and deliberate. Derek wanted me to spend my final hours at the company completely powerless, unable to access the systems I had designed, forced to sit idly, while he paraded around announcing my termination to anyone who would listen. I watched through the glass walls of his office as Derek held court with various department heads, gesturing dramatically while describing what he characterized as security violations and performance issues that had made my immediate departure necessary. His body language radiated satisfaction, the victorious pose of someone who had successfully eliminated a perceived threat to his ambitions. At 10:30, Derek gathered the entire IT department in the main conference room for what he announced as an important organizational update. 30 employees crowded around the long table, coffee cups clutched nervously as Derek positioned himself at the head of the room, with Jake standing supportively beside him. Derek's speech was a masterpiece of corporate manipulation, carefully crafted to destroy my professional reputation, while positioning himself as the decisive leader protecting the company's interests. He described a pattern of concerning behaviors that had recently come to his attention, including unauthorized access to restricted systems, resistance to necessary procedural improvements, and failure to maintain proper documentation standards. He explained that while my technical contributions had been appreciated in the past, evolving business requirements demanded more collaborative and accountable approaches to system management. The company needed IT professionals who understood the importance of teamwork, communication, and adherence to established protocols, rather than individuals who operated as isolated specialists resistant to oversight and improvement. As Derek spoke, I watched my colleagues' faces, carefully noting how many of them avoided eye contact while others nodded along with his presentation. Some looked genuinely concerned, apparently accepting his characterization of me as a problematic employee whose departure was necessary for the good of the team. Others seemed uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge Derek's narrative publicly. Jake Patterson stepped forward to explain how he would be taking over my responsibilities, immediately bringing fresh perspectives and industry best practices to optimize our infrastructure management. He outlined several improvements he planned to implement, describing my custom architecture as overly complex and difficult to maintain compared to standard solutions that any qualified technician could support effectively. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, as he suggested that my approach had created unnecessary dependencies and inefficiencies that would be eliminated through his modernization initiative. He promised to document all procedures properly and implement proper change management protocols that would prevent the kind of unauthorized modifications that had recently created security concerns. Finally, Derek turned to me with a smile that radiated false sympathy and genuine malice. He announced that my employment with TechFlow Solutions was terminated effective immediately, thanking me for my past contributions, while expressing confidence that this transition would benefit both the company and my own professional development. He declared loudly enough for everyone to hear that I was dead weight that had been dragging down productivity and creating unnecessary complications through my resistance to positive change. The words hit me like physical blows designed to humiliate me in front of colleagues I had worked alongside for over a year. But as Derek delivered his final insult, something clicked into place in my mind. A moment of crystal clarity cut through the anger and humiliation, revealing the perfect irony of what Derek had just accomplished. I remembered the emergency shutdown protocol I had built into the core architecture during the initial development phase. It was designed as a fail-safe mechanism to prevent data corruption during catastrophic system failures, requiring my biometric authentication every 72 hours to confirm that primary administrative oversight remained intact. The protocol was buried so deeply within the fundamental operating procedures that it was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look for it. It wasn't mentioned in any documentation because it was designed to function automatically, seamlessly, maintaining system integrity without requiring conscious intervention under normal circumstances. Derek had been so focused on stealing credit for my innovations and plotting my removal that he had never bothered to understand the technical dependencies that made those innovations possible. Jake had spent his time learning surface-level procedures and memorizing standard protocols, but he lacked the deep architectural knowledge necessary to recognize critical subsystems that operated below the visible interface. Neither of them had any idea that my termination would trigger an automatic countdown sequence that would begin in exactly 15 minutes. I checked my watch and confirmed the timing. My last biometric authentication had occurred at 7:15 on Tuesday morning, exactly 71 hours and 45 minutes ago. The system would begin its emergency shutdown sequence at 11:45 this morning, just as quarter-end processing reached its most intensive phase. Derek had unknowingly scheduled my humiliation for the worst possible moment, guaranteeing maximum chaos when my authentication expired and the fail-safe protocols engaged. Every major client would be running critical financial processes. Meridian Financial Services would be conducting their quarterly reconciliation procedures. Patterson Industries would be processing their largest payroll run of the year. And there would be no way to prevent the cascade failure that Derek's ignorance had just triggered. Standing in that conference room, facing the smug satisfaction on Derek's face as he savored his apparent victory, I realized that I held the ultimate trump card in a game where my opponent didn't even understand the rules he was playing by. I stepped forward calmly, meeting Derek's eyes with a level gaze that I knew would haunt him for years to come. Without breaking eye contact, I reached into my pocket and withdrew my security badge, placing it gently on the table in front of him. The words came out clear and steady, carrying the weight of absolute certainty about what was going to happen next. Derek's confident smirk began to waver as the implications of my warning penetrated his consciousness, but his arrogance was still stronger than his comprehension. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and laughed dismissively while shaking his head at what he clearly considered an empty threat from a bitter former employee. He turned to Jake Patterson, who was standing beside him, with an expression of growing uncertainty, and declared loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear that this was exactly the kind of unprofessional behavior that had made my termination necessary. He suggested that I was making desperate attempts to create drama and confusion rather than accepting responsibility for my own failures. Jake nodded along, but I could see doubt creeping into his eyes as he mentally reviewed the system architecture he thought he understood. He had spent weeks studying my documentation and observing routine maintenance procedures, but he was beginning to realize that confidence based on surface knowledge might not be sufficient for the crisis that was apparently approaching. Derek ordered security to escort me from the building, immediately confident that Jake could handle any minor technical issues that might arise during the transition. He waved dismissively toward the door, suggesting that everyone return to their normal duties, rather than being distracted by the manipulative behavior of someone who no longer had any legitimate connection to the company. But as I remained calmly in place, checking my watch and noting that 14 minutes remained before the authentication deadline, Jake's growing panic became impossible to ignore. He had rushed to his computer and was frantically attempting to access the core system administration panels, only to discover that the custom interfaces I had designed were far more complex than he had anticipated. The first signs of trouble appeared at the 12-minute mark, when automated monitoring systems began generating alerts across multiple departments. Customer service representatives started receiving confused phone calls about transaction processing delays. The accounting department discovered that their financial database queries were returning incomplete results. Sales team members found themselves unable to access client relationship management tools during crucial quarter-end negotiations. Derek's confidence finally began to crack as he watched Jake's increasingly desperate attempts to understand the diagnostic information flooding across his monitors. The error messages were written in technical language that reflected the custom protocols I had developed, making them incomprehensible to anyone who hadn't been involved in the original design process. At the 10-minute mark, Derek's phone started ringing with calls from department heads reporting various system anomalies. He assured each caller that the IT team was investigating minor technical glitches that would be resolved quickly, but his voice carried less conviction with each conversation. Jake finally looked up from his computer with genuine fear in his eyes, admitting that he couldn't understand the diagnostic data well enough to determine what was causing the problems or how to fix them. The custom architecture I had created was far more sophisticated than anything he had encountered before, with interdependent subsystems that operated according to logic that wasn't documented in any manual. Derek tried to maintain his authority by demanding that Jake focus on the essential systems and ignore minor errors that would probably resolve themselves automatically. He insisted that computer problems always seemed worse than they actually were, and that a qualified technician should be able to handle routine troubleshooting without requiring assistance from terminated employees. But at the 8-minute mark, the scope of the crisis became impossible to deny. Meridian Financial Services called to report that their quarterly reconciliation procedures had ground to a halt due to database connectivity issues. Patterson Industries discovered that their payroll processing system was generating error messages they had never seen before. 3 other major clients reported similar problems, all occurring simultaneously during the most critical business period of the quarter. Derek's facade of control crumbled as he frantically called his father-in-law's CIO, Robert Walsh, explaining that they were experiencing unexpected technical difficulties that might require additional expertise to resolve. He tried to downplay the severity of the situation, suggesting that the problems were probably related to routine maintenance procedures that hadn't been completed properly before my departure. Robert Walsh arrived at the office within minutes, his face grim as he surveyed the chaos developing around him. He quickly grasped that this wasn't a minor glitch, but a systematic failure that threatened the company's most important business relationships. The timing couldn't have been worse, with quarter-end deadlines creating pressure that left no room for extended troubleshooting procedures. At the 5-minute mark, Robert realized that conventional solutions wouldn't be sufficient to address the crisis. He approached me directly, his professional composure barely concealing his desperation, as he asked if I might be willing to provide consulting assistance to restore normal operations. I explained calmly that the situation was more complex than it appeared on the surface. The emergency protocols that were engaging couldn't simply be reversed or reset without a complete understanding of the underlying architecture. Even with full administrative access and a dedicated technical team, restoring normal operations would require at least 48 hours of intensive reconstruction work. Derek desperately tried to maintain his position, insisting that Jake and the existing IT staff could figure out the problems without needing help from someone who had just been terminated for cause. He suggested that bringing me back would set a dangerous precedent, and that the company needed to demonstrate confidence in its current technical leadership. But Jake Patterson had reached the limit of his capabilities and was no longer willing to pretend otherwise. He admitted publicly that the system architecture was beyond his expertise and that he couldn't even access the diagnostic tools necessary to understand what was failing. The custom protocols I had developed were unlike anything covered in standard training programs, and he lacked the foundational knowledge necessary to make sense of the error data. At the 2-minute mark, Derek's phone was ringing constantly with increasingly frantic calls from clients whose critical business processes had been disrupted at the worst possible time. Meridian Financial Services was threatening to terminate their $12 million contract immediately unless normal operations resumed within the hour. Patterson Industries was demanding explanations for why their payroll couldn't be processed on schedule. Robert Walsh faced the stark reality that his company's survival was hanging by a thread, and the only person who could save it was the woman his son-in-law had just humiliated and fired in front of the entire IT department. As my watch showed 11:45, exactly, the emergency shutdown protocols engaged automatically, and the last vestiges of system stability disappeared completely. The panic in Derek's eyes was indeed priceless. The emergency shutdown protocols activated with swift efficiency, systematically disabling subsystem after subsystem as cascading failures spread throughout TechFlow's entire infrastructure. Within minutes, the office had transformed from a bustling workplace into a crisis command center, with employees frantically refreshing browser windows and restarting computers that refused to connect to any network resources. Robert Walsh stood in the middle of the chaos, his usually perfect composure cracking as he fielded increasingly angry phone calls from clients whose critical business operations had ground to a complete halt. His face grew paler with each conversation, the weight of potential financial disaster settling heavily on his shoulders. Derek continued his desperate attempts to maintain control, barking orders at Jake Patterson and the other IT staff members who clustered around computer monitors displaying nothing but error messages and diagnostic screens that might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphics for all the good they did. Jake had completely abandoned any pretense of understanding the situation. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he clicked randomly through system interfaces, hoping to stumble across some obvious solution that would restore operations before the company lost its biggest clients forever. His impressive credentials and confident presentations meant nothing when faced with the reality of an infrastructure designed by someone far more capable than himself. When Robert finally approached me again, his desperation was palpable. The company's stock price had already begun dropping as word of the technical failure spread through industry networks and social media platforms. Competitors were undoubtedly preparing to contact TechFlow's clients with alternative solutions, ready to capitalize on this unexpected opportunity to steal market share. He offered to reinstate my employment immediately with a substantial raise and improved benefits package, apologizing for the misunderstanding that had led to my termination. He promised a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding my departure and suggested that perhaps there had been miscommunication about my actual performance and value to the organization. But I had already moved beyond the point where traditional employment relationships held any appeal. The previous month, I had been approached by several competitors who had heard rumors about Derek's mismanagement and were interested in acquiring my expertise for their own operations. Innovate Systems. TechFlow's primary competitor had made particularly attractive overtures about a senior position with equity participation and genuine respect for technical innovation. I explained to Robert that returning to TechFlow would require more than just financial incentives. The toxic environment that Derek had created made it impossible for me to perform effectively, and I had no interest in subjecting myself to continued political manipulation and professional sabotage. Any assistance I provided would need to be on strictly consulting terms with complete autonomy and explicit recognition of my contributions. Derek's facade finally collapsed entirely when I presented the evidence I had gathered about his unauthorized system modifications and planned security breach. The documentation was comprehensive and undeniable, showing exactly how he and Jake had created artificial vulnerabilities while planning to frame me for the resulting data exposure. Robert's face went through a spectrum of emotions as he reviewed the evidence: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally, a cold fury that I had rarely seen in corporate environments. He realized that his son-in-law hadn't just been incompetent. He had actively sabotaged the company's security infrastructure while planning to destroy an innocent employee's reputation to cover his own crimes. The board of directors began arriving within the hour, summoned by emergency calls from Robert, as the scope of the crisis became clear. These were serious business people with millions of dollars invested in TechFlow's success, and they demanded immediate answers about how their investment had been jeopardized by such spectacular mismanagement. Derek tried desperately to control the narrative, suggesting that the current crisis was somehow related to sabotage by a disgruntled former employee rather than consequences of his own actions. But the technical evidence was overwhelming, and Jake Patterson's obvious incompetence made it impossible to credibly blame external factors for internal failures. The final blow came when Meridian Financial Services formally announced their intention to terminate their contract immediately and pursue legal action for damages caused by the service disruption. Their quarterly processing had been completely derailed, causing cascade effects throughout their own client relationships and requiring expensive emergency procedures to meet regulatory deadlines. Robert faced an impossible choice: publicly acknowledge the extent of Derek's misconduct and incompetence, or watch the company collapse as more clients jumped ship and potential legal liabilities mounted. The board was already discussing emergency leadership changes and damage control strategies that would require complete transparency about what had gone wrong. I offered a final compromise that would allow TechFlow to minimize the immediate damage while acknowledging the reality of their situation. I would provide consulting services to restore basic operations within 48 hours, but only if Derek and Jake were terminated immediately, and I received public recognition for both the original system design and the current restoration effort. The consulting fees I proposed were substantial, reflecting both the urgency of the situation and the value of my unique expertise. More importantly, I demanded written acknowledgement that the system failure had been caused by unauthorized modifications to my original architecture, not by any flaws in the design itself. Derek's termination was swift and brutal, with security escorting him from the building while his colleagues watched in stunned silence. The same humiliation he had inflicted on me just hours earlier was now being visited upon him, but with the added shame of knowing that his own arrogance and incompetence had caused the disaster he was fleeing. Jake Patterson faced potential criminal charges for his role in compromising client data security, with federal investigators already showing interest in the unauthorized backdoor access that could have exposed sensitive financial information to external threats. As Derek cleaned out his office under security supervision, I began the complex process of rebuilding the infrastructure that his ignorance had destroyed. But even as I worked to restore TechFlow's operations, I knew that this chapter of my career was ending, and something far better was about to begin. The restoration of TechFlow's systems took exactly 47 hours and 32 minutes, working around the clock with a dedicated team of junior technicians who proved eager to learn from someone who actually understood the architecture they were supporting. By Sunday evening, normal operations had resumed, and Monday morning brought the satisfying sight of restored productivity and relieved clients. But the damage to TechFlow's reputation proved irreversible. Despite our successful recovery efforts, news of the catastrophic failure had spread throughout the industry, raising questions about the company's technical competency and management oversight that couldn't be answered with simple explanations about isolated incidents. Meridian Financial Services followed through on their threat to terminate their contract, taking their $12 million annual business to Innovate Systems within 2 weeks. Patterson Industries and 3 smaller clients made similar decisions, citing concerns about reliability and professional standards that made continued partnership untenable. Derek Walsh spent his final hours at TechFlow, completing the same humiliating exit procedures he had forced on me, carrying his personal belongings in a cardboard box, while former colleagues avoided eye contact. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who witnessed both scenes, though most were professional enough to avoid commenting directly on the reversal of fortune. Jake Patterson's situation became far more serious when federal investigators determined that his unauthorized system modifications constituted potential violations of data security regulations. The backdoor access he had created could have exposed client information to external threats, making him liable for criminal charges related to computer fraud and unauthorized access to protected financial data. Robert Walsh resigned as Chief Information Officer within a month, acknowledging that his failure to provide adequate oversight had enabled the misconduct that nearly destroyed the company. His departure statement accepted full responsibility for the cultural and procedural failures that had allowed nepotism and incompetence to flourish within his organization. The board of directors implemented comprehensive reforms designed to prevent similar incidents, including independent technical audits, whistleblower protection procedures, and mandatory anti-nepotism policies for all executive positions. They offered me the position of Chief Technology Officer with full authority to rebuild the IT department according to professional standards rather than political considerations. But by then, I had already accepted a far better opportunity with Innovate Systems, where I was welcomed as Vice President of Infrastructure Development with equity participation and genuine respect for my expertise. My first assignment involved implementing enhanced versions of my TechFlow innovations for the clients who had switched companies after the system failure. The transition felt like emerging from a dark tunnel into brilliant sunlight. Instead of working in isolation while fighting political battles, I found myself leading a team of talented engineers who valued collaboration and shared commitment to technical excellence. My innovations were celebrated rather than stolen, and my contributions were recognized publicly rather than being minimized in favor of management ego. Within 6 months, Innovate Systems had acquired the remnants of TechFlow's client base after the company filed for bankruptcy protection. The acquisition included rights to the infrastructure I had originally designed, which we systematically upgraded and improved using lessons learned from the previous implementation. I volunteered to oversee the integration project personally, taking particular satisfaction in dismantling the very systems I had once created and replacing them with something far superior. The new architecture incorporated advanced security features and redundant safeguards that made the original design look primitive by comparison. The experience taught me profound lessons about professional resilience and the importance of standing up for principles even when doing so seems risky. I had learned that toxic environments will always try to diminish competent people, but knowledge and integrity ultimately triumph over politics and manipulation. Derek's downfall wasn't really my victory. It was the inevitable consequence of his own choices and character flaws. True professional security doesn't come from making yourself indispensable through artificial dependencies, but from building expertise that's valued and respected in environments where competence is rewarded rather than punished. I used my experience to establish mentorship programs for women in technology fields, speaking at conferences about workplace bullying documentation strategies and the importance of building professional networks that extend beyond any single employer. My story became a cautionary tale taught in business schools about the dangers of nepotism and toxic management cultures. The scholarship fund I created provides financial support for women pursuing systems architecture careers, with particular emphasis on students from backgrounds that are traditionally underrepresented in technology fields. Recipients receive not just financial assistance, but also mentorship opportunities and internship placements with companies committed to fostering inclusive professional environments. My technical blog evolved into required reading for computer science programs across the country, providing practical insights about enterprise architecture, design, security implementation, and project management strategies. The posts that described my TechFlow experience generated thousands of comments from readers who shared similar stories about workplace betrayal and professional redemption. 2 years after leaving TechFlow, I received an invitation to speak at the annual Technology Leadership Conference about building resilient infrastructure in complex organizational environments. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek Walsh had originally been scheduled to present on the same topic before his professional disgrace made such appearances impossible. Standing at that podium addressing an audience of senior technology executives from across the industry, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that humiliating morning when Derek called me dead weight in front of my colleagues. The pain of that experience had been real and devastating, but it had also forced me to recognize my own value and refuse to accept treatment that diminished my contributions. The greatest lesson wasn't about technical architecture or system design, but about human character and the importance of maintaining integrity, even when doing so requires difficult choices. Competent people will always face challenges from those who feel threatened by excellence, but responding with professionalism and documented evidence ultimately provides more powerful protection than any security system. Derek Walsh never recovered from his disgrace, finding himself unemployable in the technology sector after word spread about his misconduct and incompetence. Jake Patterson served 8 months in federal prison for computer fraud charges and now works in retail sales, his technology career permanently destroyed by his participation in Derek's schemes. TechFlow Solutions was eventually acquired by a private equity firm that liquidated its assets and dissolved the company entirely. The corporate headquarters where I had once worked so many late nights was converted into luxury condominiums, erasing the last physical traces of the organization, where I had learned so much about both technical innovation and human nature. As I concluded my conference presentation, I posed a question to the audience that had emerged from my own painful experience. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where standing up for what's right required risking everything you had worked to build? How did you find the courage to choose integrity over security, and what did you learn about yourself in the process? The response was overwhelming, with dozens of audience members sharing their own stories about workplace courage, professional redemption, and the ultimate satisfaction that comes from refusing to compromise core values, regardless of immediate consequences. Thank you for joining me on this journey through betrayal, injustice, and ultimate triumph. If my story resonated with your own experiences or inspired you to stand up for yourself in challenging situations, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more stories about overcoming workplace adversity, and share it with others who might benefit from knowing they're not alone in facing these challenges. I wish you the courage to recognize your own worth, the strength to defend your principles when they're challenged, and the wisdom to know that temporary setbacks often lead to far better opportunities than you ever imagined possible.